finally at the part where it starts to get fun. We're gonna start bolting some things on. We're gonna start with the bottom end, build up our short block. All links to the parts are down in the description, as well as timestamps. So if you're looking for something specific, check it out. Let's get into it. So if you've seen any of my other videos, you know the first step is clean. We're gonna spray this thing down with some mineral spirits, wipe it down with a lint-free cloth, get any surfaces, maybe run some brushes through it. Anything you can, because this is your last chance to clean it. We're also going to clean the parts as we put them on there. Clean, clean, clean. And the first thing we're going to install is our camshaft. This is way easier to do without the crank in there because you have access and you can reach down inside the block and gently feed it through the cam bearings. We're going to be sure to lube this thing up with a generous amount of assembly lube as we feed it through the holes. All right, now that we got our camshaft installed, now it's time to install the crank. But before we do, we're gonna install our rear main seal in the block. Now these rear main seals are directional. You'll see this kind of bigger lip right here. The fat lip goes towards the front of the engine. We're also going to rub some assembly lube on here, or you can use engine oil if you're gonna be firing it up right away. If your engine is sitting for more than like a week or so, you can just rub a thin layer of grease on there, which is what I'm gonna do. And then we'll install the upper crank bearings, being sure to lube them up with assembly lube. And then we're also gonna rub some assembly lube on our crank because any metal to metal surfaces need to be good and slippery. And then we gently lower in the crank, making sure it's going in there straight, nothing's binding. And then once you got your crank lowered down, give it a little bit of a rotate just to make sure it's spinning freely. All right, now it's time to install the caps. And before we do, I'm gonna put a little tiny film of RTV fluid right here at the end by your rear main seal. This will just kind of help seal this area off a little bit more. You do not want to touch your crank with the RTV or the seal with your RTV. Now we'll install the bearing and the rear main seal in the thrust cap. And speaking of thrust cap, I made a couple of little modifications here just for added flow, because we're gonna be running a high volume oil pump with our aftermarket pan. So I just kind of smoothed it out a little bit. Make sure you got the right cap. This one is number 4, even though you can barely see the stamp. And there's usually an arrow that points towards the front of the engine. So you gotta make sure these are in the right orientation as well. So once you get the caps on kind of hand tight, we're gonna torque all of them except for the thrust cap. So we'll do the first pass at 50. Just kind of start from the middle and work your way out. Now on the 4-bolt mains, the inner bolts get torqued to 70 foot-pounds and the outer bolts get torqued to 65 foot-pounds. Cap number 1 bolts get torqued to 80, and so do the thrust cap bolts. All right, so now that I got all of the caps torqued to where they're supposed to be, except for the thrust cap, now we need to align our thrust bearing. And we do that by tapping the crank forward, backwards, and then ending on the forward. And then we can wedge it and torque the thrust cap bolts to 80 foot-pounds. I'll wedge that in there like so, and then we can torque those bolts to 80 foot-pounds. So if you're good and you know what you're doing, you're gonna mark all of these bolts with a paint pen once you torque them. That way you don't forget that you already torqued them, and you don't assume that you already torqued them and you didn't torque them and stuff goes flying apart. But if you're like me, you're just gonna trick yourself into thinking you're gonna remember and just leave it alone. Either way. Now that we got a crankshaft in, now we're gonna assemble our timing gears. Okay, remember we went dot to dot on this, so I rotated this so this dot is facing the cam, and then stick our cam gear on there so that the dot lines up with the dot. All right, now we'll install our cam button that we custom fit to this thing during pre-assembly, and our cam retainer plate. And we're gonna apply some red Loctite to the bolts. Okay, and then we'll block off the crank here so it doesn't spin. And then these get torqued to 20 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our timing cover. Before we do that though, we need to install our seal. I didn't want to install the cheap one that came in this cheap Amazon timing cover kit, so I actually got a Fel-Pro one. They do make special tools for these, but of course I don't have one. So what people traditionally do is just kind of go to town with this with a hammer and just beat the living daylights out of it. That sometimes works, but these ones, for some reason, always tend to fight you. So I think I have a better system for this. I got this giant washer here that's bigger than the hole here. This is from the body mount off of that S10 that I tore apart to make the Hodgepodge Dodge chassis. And then I made this piece right here that's bigger than the seal on the outside, but the seal can go over this bit in the inside, and then you just bolt it together. And hopefully it'll just squeeze it all together and it'll go in straight and it all works. First, to protect this rubber sealant here, I'm just gonna wipe a little tiny, small little bit amount of grease in here. This seal gets greased anyways once you install the harmonic balancer. You don't wanna put grease on the outside, that has to go in dry. You don't want any sealant, no RTV, no kind of lubricant, nothing. The coating that they have on here is enough to seal it as is. I'm also gonna put a little bit of grease on the washer here, just to help the bolt head slide a little bit easier. And the idea is you want this to go in perfectly straight, so if it goes cockeyed at all, it won't really go in there. Now this will go on here, like so. Yeah, and so you just kind of holds it in place just like that. Trying to get it just to kind of be even all the way around. Let's just hand tie it for now. Might be a little high on this side. Nope, it's going crooked. Sometimes you gotta improvise. A little high on this side right here, but it's pretty much in there. Just need to pound that down a little bit further, I think. So now it's pretty flat all the way around. Looks good. Before we install the timing chain cover, we're gonna put a ton of oil all over the chain and the gear just to get this kind of pre-lubed. Now the infamous debate, what side does the gasket go? Stripes out or no stripes out? I'm gonna go stripes out. We're gonna put these bolts on here hand tight, actually just a little bit less than hand tight, because once we get our harmonic balancer on there, it'll help center this timing cover and then we can torque it down. Now when you install your dampener, you don't want to use your dampener retaining bolt to kind of drive it and pull it on there, because this is not meant for that. You're not going to get enough threads in your crank to pull it on there, and it's going to probably eventually break off and you're going to have to pull the crank out and drill it out, possibly put new threads on there. You also don't want to use a hammer to drive this thing on there, because if you do, you're going to damage your main bearings. So I know I say it all the time, there's a special tool for this and I don't got it, but guess what? I do got this one. These are not that expensive. They're probably like under 20 for sure. Definitely a tool worth investing in, because this is the only way to put this thing on there the right way and not damage anything that you've already done and have to redo things. So well worth the investment. Now when we put the dampener on the crank, we want to line it up with that little key, and we're actually going to rub a little bit of grease on here, just a tiny little bit, to help it go on a little bit easier and make sure we don't damage our seal. Once we line it up with that keyway, we'll just kind of push it on as far as it'll go. You also need to block your crank so it doesn't turn as you're trying to tighten this. Then we're gonna thread our tool into the crank as far as it'll go. Then you just bring this bearing up and tighten this nut until this thing bottoms out. You'll be able to feel it once it does bottom out. Next we'll install our dampener retaining bolt. This one gets lubed with engine oil, and then the book calls for 65 pounds, although some places say to torque this to 85 pounds. What I've discovered is it just depends on your application. If you're high RPM or high horsepower, you want to go more to 85 pounds. So I'm gonna go happy medium, 70 pounds. All right, let's get these pistons installed. First, we're gonna wipe these down with some mineral spirits and a lint-free cloth, just to make sure it's clean. And of course, we'll clean the pistons. And then we'll wipe down these with oil. We'll wipe down the cylinder walls with some oil, put some fuel line over the bolts so we make sure we don't scratch the crank. Next, we'll install our ring compressor, and we have to double check the rings to make sure they're in the orientation that we want them to be. So you want the ring compressor to compress the rings, but you do want a little bit of the skirts of the piston to be hanging down because that's what's going to guide it into the hole. You also want to make sure that your pistons are in the right orientation. We'll put some assembly lube on the bearings, in the rod, and the caps. And then we'll position the crank so the journal is all the way at the bottom. And then we'll gently lower this into the hole. You're going to use a rubber or a wooden handle to tap it down into the hole until it comes out of the ring compressor and into your engine block. Just like that, the bottom is out. We'll make sure the caps go in the right orientation. Put a drop of oil on the nuts to lubricate them so we get the correct torque. And so since these are stock rods with 3/8 inch bolts, the spec for the torque is 45 pounds. Now we'll just rinse and repeat for all of the other pistons. All right, I got all the pistons installed, so now we can use number 1 piston to find true top dead center. So we'll just rotate our engine until we get that piston to the top in the number 1 cylinder hole. Now this stock pointer is not going to work because of the aluminum timing cover we got. It actually covers the line on our dampener. So I got this aftermarket pointer, which will fit on here perfectly, like so. And that'll actually line up with where that dot is. Dot, slot, whatever. All right, so we can dial in where top dead center is. I got my dial bore gauge back on piston number 1 and I zeroed it out. Now we just gotta rotate the crank and find the spot where it hangs out at top dead center. So that's gone up about 10 degrees or so, and then now it's starting to go back down. So we'll go back to where it stops, which is right about there. And you know what, looky here, our pointer is pretty much exactly on top dead center. So I'm gonna call that good. All right, now that we got all of our pistons in place, we got our harmonic dampener, everything's at top dead center. I did a couple of things. I just couldn't live with that nasty silver, so I painted the harmonic balancer black. And also because the pistons are in there, the crank is actually kind of hard to turn right now, so I installed a couple of long bolts in where the pulley on the dampener goes in. This just makes it easier to turn with a long bar of some kind. I also added this little billet cover for the fuel pump because I'm not going to be running the standard fuel pump off your camshaft with the push rod. I'm going to be running an external fuel pump, so that gets blocked off because I don't need it. And now it's time to button up a few more things. Let's start with, what should we start with? So next we're going to install our oil filter adapter. And the adapter has this little check valve on there. From the factory, that is over here kind of covering up the hole. Not a bad thing because that's the way they designed it. It does no harm though to flip it around. It only creates less of an obstruction for that hole right there. These bolts do need blue Loctite and they get torqued to 7.5 pound-feet, which again is not very much. All right, so now to check to make sure our pickup is at the right depth, we need to install our pump. And I actually got this ARP stud for the oil pump to go onto. So we'll put this in there, and according to the instructions, you just put this in there hand tight. We're not gonna torque this down quite yet. Once we get that on there, then we're gonna put our copper gasket, making sure that's in the right orientation. This opening here obviously goes to where that hole is. Now I'm using a copper gasket because we're gonna be installing a high volume oil pump to go with our 6-quart deep sump oil pan that I got from Summit Racing. This pan is an upgrade from the stock 4-quart oil pan. It's got this baffle in there to keep the oil in the pickup tube area when you're braking or accelerating. It also has this crank scraper on here, which is also handy. Now, if you're running a stock oil pan, you don't want to use a high volume oil pump because it could pump too much oil through there and potentially suck the pan dry, and then you're running your pump dry. Nobody wants that. Now, the stock oil pumps don't use a gasket from the factory. They're also flat versus this high volume oil pump, which has this dished out section, which is why we want to run the copper gasket on there to make sure that the oil goes where it's supposed to go. So next we'll install the pump. And again, this only goes in one way. Make sure it's all the way seated down in there, like so. And then with these ARP studs and bolts and stuff, they actually have ARP lube. You can use engine oil, but you have to torque it to 85 pound-feet. With the ARP lube, you torque it to 65 pound-feet. So we're gonna lube up both the washer and the nut to get a correct torque reading. Now that we got that torqued down, we're gonna put our pickup tube on here. And now before we press this in there and commit to it, we can measure the depth with this just kind of sitting in there like so, from the block to the top of your pickup tube. It looks to be about 8 1/8. Now our depth that we're shooting for is gonna be anywhere from around 1/4 inch to about 3/8 of an inch or so. So we'll write that down. So next we need to measure the thickness of our gasket. It looks to be 0.1575-ish. So 0.15625 is 5/32. We can round that up to 3/16. So to get the depth of the pan, we're gonna put a straight edge across the rails, and we'll put our tape measure down in here, and it looks like it's pretty close to 8 3/16. So now we add the gasket to the pan depth, and we get 8 6/16. And then we subtract the 8 1/8. To make it easy, we're gonna go 8 2/16 from the 8 6/16, and that leaves us with 4/16, which is equal to 1/4 inch. So we're right in the ballpark of where we need to be. So now we'll install our pickup. And the pickup has these little tabs on here that go where these bolts are right here. So we'll need to remove these bolts in order to fully get it on there. Any guesses on what size those are? I think they are 7/16. Could be 3/8. Nope, 7/16. Yeah, gum, are they metric? Probably 10 millimeter. Maybe they are 10 millimeter. There are. Ay, ay, ay. Darn metric system. Don't lose these bolts. So now we need to press this pickup tube into the pump, and there is a special tool for that, but I don't got it. You can use a 16 millimeter wrench along with a hammer. The 16 millimeter wrench is just wide enough to go over the tube, but doesn't go past the collar that's on there. And then you're just gonna tap it in place with your favorite hammer. However, you do not want to hammer this thing on there when it's installed on your thrust cap on your engine, because it could cause misalignment of some things. So we're actually gonna remove this from our engine and head on over to the bench vise. All right, now this is cast iron, so we don't want to clamp onto it. We're gonna put a towel down here, and since we need to pound it into here, we're looking for kind of this surface area here to go in the groove in our vise. Something like that. Again, we're not clamping down on anything, we're just giving it a backstop to tap this thing in there. So, let me line this up again. Just like so. Get our 16 millimeter, just like so, and we'll give it a few taps and see what happens. These things do kind of tend to be a problem and tend to fight you quite a bit. That one actually went in there fairly easy. Wow, that was like the easiest one I've ever done. That's crazy. So now we can reinstall the pump, but before we do, we're gonna install the drive shaft for it. And it's got this metal sleeve on here as opposed to the traditional nylon sleeve, which can sometimes break. This one's attached to it, so there's no chance of it breaking and rattling throughout your engine. So, bit of an upgrade. Here we go, just like that. We'll reapply the ARP lube to the washer and the threads for the nut, and then we'll torque this down to 65 foot-pounds. Now we can bolt down the pickup to the pump, and these get torqued to 90 inch-pounds. Next we'll install our gasket for our oil pan, but before we do, we want to apply some RTV to the corners of the thrust cap, as well as up here on the timing cover, because if it's gonna leak, it's gonna leak right in these corners right here. While this RTV is still wet, we'll place this oil pan gasket over the top of it, and then put the oil pan on there, and we'll run our bolts down hand tight and let it set up for just a little bit. Now that the RTV has set up, we're gonna torque down the bolts in a circular pattern from the inside out, similar to a cylinder head. These 1/4 inch bolts get torqued to 80 inch-pounds, while the 5/16 bolts get torqued to 165 inch-pounds. All right, and the final step, we are going to install temporarily our oil filter. I like to install these screens here, especially on a brand new build, because that's going to catch any little particles or anything that may have gotten missed during the cleaning process that's still floating around inside your engine. Probably run this for the first 500 miles or so, because we're gonna change the oil at that point anyways. And then we'll install our filter. Make sure you rub a little bit of oil along the gasket so it makes it easier to come off. We will take this back off and fill it full of oil before we prime the engine later on. And there it is. We got ourselves a short block. Bottom end is complete. Now it's time to flip this thing over and start working on the top end. A lot of fun stuff planned for that. That's gonna have to wait for the next episode though, so make sure you subscribe, hit that bell. Get yourself a hat or a koozie or a shirt or something over here. Socials down there. And I'll see you on the next one.